Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to fall in love when a single kiss could mean the difference between life and death? When choosing to follow your heart could result in execution by firing squad? When the most natural human emotion becomes the most dangerous act of rebellion imaginable? Picture this. It's August 1944, and the streets of Paris are about to witness something extraordinary. The liberation everyone has dreamed of for 4 long years is finally within reach. But hidden among the celebrations and chaos, tucked away in the shadows of ancient cobblestone alleys, there exists a love story so dangerous, so forbidden, that it could destroy 2 lives with a single moment of tenderness. What I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about courage, about sacrifice, and about the impossible choices people make when love collides with the machinery of war. This isn't just another historical account. This is the story of Margit and Klaus, 2 people who should have been enemies, who should have never met, whose love was so dangerous that it could have cost them everything they held dear. I've spent months researching this incredible account, piecing together fragments from personal diaries, resistance records, and testimonies that survived the liberation. What I discovered was a love story so heart-stopping, so impossible, and so real that it reads like the most dramatic fiction ever written. But every stolen glance, every whispered word, every heart-pounding moment actually happened during those final weeks before Paris was freed. Margit was 23 years old in the summer of 1944, working as a seamstress in a small shop on the left bank. She had dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, hands that moved with the precision of someone who understood beauty, and a spirit that 4 years of occupation had not managed to break. Before the war, she had dreamed of opening her own boutique, of creating clothes that would make women feel elegant and confident. Now, she spent her days mending uniforms and altering clothes for people who could barely afford to eat. Klaus was 25, a communications officer stationed in Paris during what everyone knew would be the final months of German control. He came from a small town in Bavaria where his father had been a music teacher, and his mother grew flowers in a garden that seemed to bloom regardless of the season. He had studied literature at university before the war, dreaming of becoming a writer, of crafting stories that would capture the complexity of human experience. Instead, he found himself wearing a uniform that represented everything he had grown to question. Their worlds should never have intersected. The carefully constructed barriers of occupation, the rigid social boundaries that separated conquered from conqueror, the deadly consequences that awaited anyone who dared to cross those lines, all of these forces conspired to keep people like Margit and Klaus as far apart as possible. Yet fate, as it often does during the most chaotic moments in history, had different plans entirely. The first time they saw each other was not romantic. It was not planned. It was a moment of pure chance that could have ended in tragedy for both of them. Klaus had been walking through the Marais district on a routine inspection when he noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. A young woman was standing in front of a bombed-out bookstore, tears streaming down her face as she held a water-damaged volume of poetry in her hands. The building had been hit during an Allied bombing raid the night before, and books were scattered across the street like fallen leaves. Margit was trying to salvage whatever she could, not because the books had monetary value, but because they represented something precious that was being systematically destroyed by the war. She had grown up visiting this bookstore with her father, spending Sunday afternoons browsing through collections of French poetry and classical literature. Klaus recognized the book she was holding. It was a collection of Verlaine's poems, the same edition he had owned before the war, the same verses he had memorized during his university years when literature felt like the most important thing in the world. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, he approached her and spoke the opening lines of one of Verlaine's most famous poems. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible divide. Margit looked up, startled to hear perfect French spoken with a slight German accent. shocked to discover that the enemy soldier standing before her knew the same poetry that had shaped her understanding of beauty and truth. For a moment that felt like an eternity, they simply looked at each other, two human beings recognizing something unexpected and profound in each other's eyes. What happened next defied every rule of occupation, every expectation of wartime behavior, every rational thought about survival and safety. Klaus helped Margit gather the scattered books, working beside her in silence as they tried to salvage what remained of the destroyed shop. They moved with the careful efficiency of people who understood that they were creating something dangerous simply by being in the same space, yet neither could bring themselves to walk away. When they had collected everything worth saving, Klaus did something that could have cost him his career and possibly his life. He offered to carry the books to wherever Margit needed to take them. She should have refused. She should have walked away without another word. She should have reported the incident to the resistance contacts who might have found ways to use such information. Instead, she found herself accepting his help, leading him through the winding streets of the Marais toward the small apartment where she lived alone. They walked in silence, both acutely aware of the stares from passers-by who witnessed the strange sight of a German officer carrying books for a young French woman. The danger of their situation was obvious to everyone who saw them, yet something stronger than fear or rational thinking kept them moving forward together. With each step, they were crossing lines that could never be uncrossed, entering territory that was forbidden not just by military regulations, but by every social convention of occupied Paris. At Margit's building, Klaus carefully placed the rescued books on the steps and prepared to leave. This should have been the end of their encounter, a brief moment of shared humanity in the midst of inhumane circumstances. But as he turned to go, Margit spoke his name, though he had never told her what it was. She had read it on his uniform, she explained, and wanted to thank him properly for his kindness. The sound of his name spoken in her voice, with that particular French accent that made even the most ordinary words sound like music, stopped Klaus in his tracks. He had not heard his name spoken with such gentleness in months. Military life had reduced him to rank and function, stripping away the individual identity that had once defined him. To hear himself recognized as a human being rather than a symbol of occupation felt like awakening from a long sleep. They began talking, carefully at first, about the books they had saved, about poetry and literature, about the strange coincidence that had brought them together in front of the destroyed bookstore. Klaus told her about the collection of French poetry he had owned before the war, how Verlaine's words had helped him understand that beauty could transcend national boundaries. Margit shared her memories of visiting the bookstore with her father, how literature had become her refuge during the darkest days of occupation. As the afternoon stretched into evening, their conversation deepened in ways that surprised them both. They discovered shared passions that had nothing to do with the war dividing their nations. Klaus spoke of his dreams of becoming a writer, his love of music inherited from his father, his confusion about how the world had become so twisted that young men like himself were sent to occupy places they had once hoped to visit as tourists and students. Margit described her plans for opening a boutique after the war, her belief that creating beautiful things was a form of resistance against the ugliness that seemed to consume everything around them. She told him about the small acts of defiance that kept her spirit alive, the way she would deliberately make German uniforms slightly too tight or leave subtle imperfections that only she would notice. What struck Klaus most powerfully was Margit's refusal to see him as merely an enemy in uniform. She looked past the symbols of occupation to the person underneath, someone who was also trapped by circumstances beyond his control, someone who was struggling to maintain his humanity in an inhuman situation. For the first time in months, Klaus felt seen and understood rather than feared or hated. Margit, meanwhile, was discovering that her preconceptions about German soldiers were far more complicated than she had imagined. Klaus spoke with genuine remorse about the occupation, expressed real concern for the suffering of French civilians, and demonstrated a depth of culture and sensitivity that contradicted everything she had been taught to expect from the enemy. As darkness fell over Paris, both realized they had spent hours talking without noticing the passage of time. The city around them had settled into the uneasy quiet that characterized life under occupation, but their conversation had created a small bubble of normalcy, a space where the war felt distant and the future seemed possible. They should have said goodbye then, should have recognized the danger they were creating for themselves and everyone around them. Instead, they made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Klaus asked if he could see her again, not as a German officer and a French civilian, but as two people who had discovered an unexpected connection in the midst of chaos. Margit's answer would determine not just their immediate future, but the trajectory of a love story that would unfold against the backdrop of liberation, resistance, and the deadly consequences that awaited anyone who dared to love across enemy lines during the final weeks of occupied Paris. Paris. The word that escaped Margit's lips was barely audible, yet it carried the weight of revolution. Yes. Such a simple word, yet in that moment, in that place, it became the most dangerous syllable in all of Paris. With that single breath, she had agreed to something that could destroy them both, something that defied every survival instinct that 4 years of occupation had burned into her soul. Klaus felt his heart stop completely before racing back to life, with an intensity that made his hands tremble. He had expected rejection, had prepared himself for the sensible response that would protect them both from the catastrophic consequences of what they were contemplating. Instead, he found himself staring into dark eyes that held the same mixture of terror and exhilaration that was coursing through his own veins. They arranged to meet the following evening at a small cafe near the Seine, a place that remained neutral territory where French civilians and German personnel occasionally crossed paths without raising immediate suspicion. The Café de la Paix had somehow managed to maintain its pre-war atmosphere despite the occupation, serving watered-down coffee and stale pastries to anyone who could afford them, asking no questions about politics or allegiances. The 24 hours that separated them felt like a lifetime. Klaus went through the motions of his military duties, while his mind remained completely focused on the young woman who had somehow managed to see past his uniform to the person he had almost forgotten existed. Every routine task felt surreal. Every conversation with fellow officers seemed to be conducted in a foreign language. Every moment stretched endlessly as he counted down to their planned meeting. Margit experienced her own form of torture as she tried to concentrate on her work while battling the voice in her head that screamed warnings about the insanity of what she was planning. She had survived 4 years of occupation by being careful, by following rules that kept her invisible and safe. Now she was preparing to throw away everything she had learned about survival for the sake of a man whose very presence in her city represented everything she had been taught to resist. Her hands shook as she attempted to sew, pricking her fingers repeatedly on needles that had never betrayed her before. The familiar rhythm of her work, which had always provided comfort during the darkest moments of occupation, now felt impossible to maintain. Every stitch reminded her of the choice she had made, the line she was preparing to cross, the future she was risking for reasons she could not fully understand or explain. The resistance contacts who occasionally visited her shop would have been horrified if they knew what she was planning. Margit had provided small services for the underground network, nothing dramatic or dangerous, simply allowing her shop to be used as a message drop and providing information about German officers who brought uniforms for alteration. The thought of these brave men and women discovering her secret relationship filled her with shame that competed with the anticipation building in her chest. Klaus faced similar internal battles as he prepared for their meeting. His fellow officers would view any relationship with a French civilian as a betrayal of military discipline and German superiority. The racial laws that governed occupation policy made such connections not just forbidden but punishable by court-martial and possible execution. Yet something about Margit had awakened feelings he thought had been permanently buried under months of military routine and moral compromise. The evening arrived with agonizing slowness, bringing with it a summer rain that turned the cobblestone streets into mirrors, reflecting the dim light of carefully rationed street lamps. Klaus arrived at the cafe first, choosing a corner table that would allow him to see both the entrance and the street beyond. His uniform drew curious glances from other patrons, but the Café de la Paix had become accustomed to the strange social dynamics of occupation, where enemies sometimes sat at adjacent tables without acknowledging each other's existence. When Margit appeared in the doorway, her dark hair damp from the rain and her simple dress somehow elegant despite its obvious age and careful mending, Klaus felt the same jolt of recognition that had struck him outside the bombed bookstore. She moved through the crowded cafe with quiet grace, ignoring the whispered comments her presence at a German officer's table generated among the other customers. Their conversation began carefully, both aware that they were being observed and overheard by people whose loyalties could shift without warning. They spoke of safe topics at first: the weather, the quality of the coffee, the books they had rescued from the destroyed shop. But underneath these mundane exchanges ran currents of meaning that transformed ordinary words into intimate communications. Klaus told her about his hometown in Bavaria, painting pictures with words of mountain valleys, where wildflowers bloomed in meadows that had never known the sound of artillery. He described his parents' house, where his mother still tended a garden that produced vegetables for neighbors whose sons had been sent to fight in foreign lands. His voice carried longing for a world that felt increasingly distant from the gray reality of occupied Paris. Margit shared memories of Paris before the war, when the cafe where they now sat had been filled with students and artists who debated literature and politics late into the night. She told him about walking along the Seine with her father, feeding bread to ducks that had since disappeared, visiting museums that now stood empty or served as administrative offices for the occupation authorities. As they talked, something extraordinary began to happen. The careful barriers they had constructed around their hearts started to dissolve, replaced by a connection that felt both immediate and inevitable. They discovered that they had read many of the same books, admired the same poets, shared dreams of creating beauty in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything lovely and meaningful. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the cafe windows and providing a natural soundtrack to their deepening conversation. Other patrons began leaving as the evening progressed, until Klaus and Margit found themselves nearly alone in the dimly lit space. The proprietor, an elderly man who had witnessed 4 years of strange encounters between occupiers and occupied, continued serving them coffee without comment, perhaps understanding that some human connections transcended the artificial boundaries that politics tried to impose. Klaus found himself telling Margit things he had never shared with anyone, not his fellow officers, not his family in letters home, not even himself during the long nights when sleep refused to come. He spoke of his growing disillusionment with the war, his horror at witnessing actions that contradicted everything his parents had taught him about decency and honor. He described feeling trapped in a uniform that made him complicit in things he could not support, serving a cause he no longer believed in, if he ever truly had. Margit listened without judgment, recognizing in his words the same moral struggle that kept her awake at night. She told him about the impossible choices that occupation forced on ordinary people, the daily compromises that felt like small betrayals of everything she valued. She described the weight of hatred she carried, not just for the Germans who had conquered her city, but for her own powerlessness to resist in any meaningful way. Their hands found each other across the small table, fingers intertwining in a gesture that was both tender and revolutionary. The simple act of touch, skin against skin, became a declaration of war against the forces that insisted they must remain enemies. In that moment, they were no longer a German officer and a French civilian, but simply two human beings who had found something precious in each other. The cafe owner approached their table as the evening grew late, his expression kind but concerned. He spoke quietly to Margaret in rapid French, warning her about the dangers of being seen with a German officer so late at night. His words were gentle but urgent, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many people make choices that ended in tragedy. Klaus understood enough French to grasp the warning, and he prepared to leave immediately, not wanting to create problems for Margaret or the cafe owner who had allowed them this evening of impossible normalcy. But Margaret surprised him by standing and announcing that she would walk with him partway back to his quarters, ignoring the cafe owner's sharp intake of breath and the obvious concern in his weathered face. They stepped out into the rain-soaked Paris night, walking slowly through streets that had become unfamiliar during 4 years of occupation. The city felt different somehow, charged with an energy that had been building for weeks. There were rumors everywhere of Allied advances, whispered reports of German preparations for evacuation, subtle signs that the liberation everyone had dreamed of might finally be approaching. As they walked, Klaus and Margit talked about the future with a mixture of hope and desperation. They both understood that their relationship existed in a bubble that could burst at any moment, that the approaching liberation would bring changes that might tear them apart forever. Yet they could not resist planning, dreaming, imagining what might be possible if the world somehow rearranged itself to allow their love to flourish. At a corner where their paths would naturally diverge, they stopped and faced each other under a street lamp that cast dancing shadows on the wet pavement. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Klaus reached up to touch Margit's face, his fingers gentle against her rain-damp skin, and she leaned into his touch with a sigh that seemed to carry all the longing and fear and desperate hope that had been building inside her since their first meeting. What happened next would haunt them both for the rest of their lives, a moment of connection so perfect and so dangerous that it would define everything that followed in their impossible love story. Klaus leaned down slowly, giving Margit every opportunity to pull away, to break the spell that was drawing them together like gravity itself. But she remained perfectly still, her eyes closing as his lips found hers in a kiss that lasted only seconds, yet felt like it contained entire lifetimes of possibility and terror. The kiss was soft, tentative, filled with the desperate sweetness of two people who understood they might be stealing their only moment of happiness from a world determined to keep them apart. When they separated, both were trembling, not from the cold rain that continued to fall around them, but from the magnitude of what they had just shared. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, committed an act that transformed them from strangers into conspirators in the most dangerous rebellion imaginable. Neither spoke as they reluctantly parted ways, Klaus disappearing into the shadows that led toward the German administrative district, while Margit hurried through the narrow streets toward her apartment. But both carried the memory of that kiss like a secret flame, something precious and forbidden that would either illuminate their path forward or consume them entirely. The following days passed in a haze of anticipation and terror. They had not arranged another meeting, understanding instinctively that they needed time to process what was happening between them, to decide whether they were brave enough to continue down a path that led toward certain disaster. Yet both found excuses to walk through areas where they might accidentally encounter each other, hearts racing every time they glimpsed a familiar silhouette in the distance. Klaus threw himself into his military duties with renewed intensity, hoping that professional obligations would distract him from thoughts of dark eyes and gentle hands. He volunteered for additional assignments, worked late into the night on communications reports, and engaged in conversations with fellow officers about topics that had never interested him before. But nothing could silence the voice in his head that whispered Margit's name during every quiet moment. Margit attempted her own form of distraction, taking on extra sewing projects and spending long hours in her shop perfecting alterations that required only routine attention. She told herself that the strange interlude with Klaus had been a momentary madness brought on by loneliness and the stress of occupation, that she would return to her normal life of quiet resistance and patient waiting for liberation. But her hands seemed to move independently, stitching patterns that reminded her of the poetry they had discussed, creating small hidden details in her work that felt like messages to someone who would never see them. The city around them was changing with increasing rapidity. Allied bombing raids had become more frequent and more precise, targeting German installations with an accuracy that suggested detailed intelligence about occupation infrastructure. There were reports of German units being moved out of Paris, of equipment being loaded onto trains heading east, of administrative offices being quietly evacuated during the night. The French civilian population sensed the shifting atmosphere like animals detecting an approaching storm. Conversations in cafes and shops carried new undertones of excitement mixed with apprehension. People who had survived 4 years of occupation, by keeping their heads down, and their opinions to themselves began exchanging meaningful glances and carefully coded comments about the future. Children who had known only wartime began asking their parents questions about what peace would look like. Klaus received orders that confirmed what the rumors had been suggesting. German forces were beginning a strategic withdrawal from Paris, a gradual evacuation disguised as routine redeployment, but clearly designed to avoid the chaos of a last-minute retreat. His communications unit was scheduled to be relocated within 2 weeks, transferred to a facility outside the city, where they would continue their work of coordinating the increasingly desperate German defensive efforts. The news hit him like a physical blow. Leaving Paris meant leaving Margit, abandoning whatever fragile connection they had established before it could develop into something meaningful. He had found her just as he was about to lose her forever, discovered love at the precise moment when circumstances made it impossible to pursue. The cruel irony felt like punishment for daring to hope that happiness might be possible even in the midst of global catastrophe. Margit learned about the German withdrawal from her resistance contacts, men and women who had spent years planning for the day when the occupation would finally end. They spoke of liberation with a mixture of joy and caution, understanding that the transition period would be dangerous and unpredictable. German forces might attempt to destroy infrastructure as they retreated, collaborators would face violent retribution from their neighbors, and the power vacuum left by departing authorities could lead to chaos before legitimate government could be reestablished. The knowledge that Klaus would soon be gone filled her with emotions she struggled to understand. Relief that the occupation was ending warred with grief over losing someone who had become important to her in ways she had never expected. She told herself that his departure would solve the impossible problem their relationship represented, that she could return to being a patriotic French woman, celebrating her country's liberation, without the moral complications of loving an enemy soldier. Yet the thought of never seeing him again, never hearing his voice speaking French poetry with that gentle German accent, never experiencing again the way he looked at her as if she were something precious and miraculous, created a hollow ache in her chest that grew stronger with each passing day. 3 days before his unit was scheduled to depart, Klaus made a decision that defied every instinct of military discipline and personal safety. He returned to the small street where Margit's shop was located, not in uniform this time, but wearing civilian clothes he had acquired through means he preferred not to examine too closely. The risk was enormous, as German personnel caught out of uniform could be shot as spies, but the alternative of leaving without saying goodbye felt impossible to bear. He waited in the shadows across from her shop as evening approached, watching through the window as she completed her final tasks of the day. The sight of her moving through the familiar routine of closing her workspace filled him with tenderness and desperation in equal measure. She looked tired, he noticed, as if she too had been sleeping poorly and struggling to concentrate on ordinary activities. When she finally locked the shop door and stepped onto the street, Klaus emerged from the shadows and spoke her name softly. She spun around with a gasp, her hand flying to her heart as she recognized his voice. For a moment they simply stared at each other, both shocked by how much they had missed the other's presence during their brief separation. Without words, they began walking together through the familiar streets of the Marais, neither caring who might observe their reunion. The city felt different in the evening light, charged with the electricity of impending change. Barricades were being quietly constructed in strategic locations. Weapons were being distributed to resistance fighters who had waited years for the opportunity to strike back, and German patrols had become less frequent and more nervous. They found themselves at the same corner where they had shared their first kiss, standing under the same street lamp that had witnessed their transformation from strangers into something far more dangerous and precious. This time, Klaus did not hesitate before taking her in his arms, and Margit responded with a passion that surprised them both. Their second kiss was deeper, more urgent, filled with the desperate intensity of people who understood they were stealing moments from time itself. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their faces flushed with desire and fear, and the reckless abandon that comes from knowing you have nothing left to lose. Klaus told her about his imminent departure, watching as the news hit her like a physical blow. Margit closed her eyes and leaned against him, drawing strength from his presence while trying to absorb the reality that their impossible love story was about to end almost before it had truly begun. But even as they held each other in the growing darkness, both were beginning to understand that their connection had become something neither was willing to abandon without a fight. The approaching liberation that threatened to separate them forever might also provide opportunities that had never existed during the static years of occupation. In the chaos that was coming, old rules would be broken, new possibilities would emerge, and two people who had found each other against impossible odds might discover ways to stay together that had never seemed possible before. The question that hung between them, unspoken but understood by both, was whether they were brave enough to gamble everything they had on the slim chance that love could survive the storm of liberation that was about to engulf them all. The answer came not in words, but in the way their hands found each other in the darkness, fingers intertwining with the desperate grip of people who refuse to let go even when the world demands they surrender. Klaus spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper as he outlined a plan so audacious, so reckless, that it took Margit's breath away completely. He had been studying the evacuation procedures, listening to conversations between senior officers who assumed their communications specialist was too focused on technical details to pay attention to strategic discussions. The German withdrawal would happen in stages, with non-essential personnel leaving first while combat units maintained defensive positions until the final moment. Klaus's unit would depart in the second wave, giving him perhaps 5 days to arrange something that had never been attempted before. Desertion was punishable by immediate execution, but Klaus had discovered that in the chaos of retreat, individual soldiers sometimes simply vanished from their units without official notice for days or even weeks. If he could disappear at precisely the right moment, during the confusion that would inevitably accompany the final German departure from Paris, he might be able to blend into the civilian population before anyone realized he was missing. Margit listened to his plan with growing alarm and admiration. The logistics were staggering, the risks almost beyond calculation. Klaus would need civilian identity papers, clothing that would allow him to pass as French, a place to hide during the dangerous transition period when German deserters would be hunted by both retreating forces and advancing liberators. Most importantly, he would need someone willing to risk everything to help him, someone whose own safety would be forfeit if his deception was discovered. She understood immediately that he was asking her to become his accomplice in treason, to transform their forbidden romance into active collaboration with an enemy deserter. The resistance contacts who trusted her with small favors would view such actions as the ultimate betrayal. Her neighbors, who had tolerated her apparent neutrality during the occupation, would demand her head if they discovered she had harbored a German soldier during liberation. Even Klaus himself might not survive the rage of French civilians, who had spent 4 years dreaming of revenge against their occupiers. Yet as she listened to him speak, watching his face in the dim streetlight as he outlined each impossible detail of their survival plan, Margaret felt something crystallizing in her chest that had nothing to do with rational calculation and everything to do with the kind of love that makes people willing to die for each other. She had found something precious in the midst of the most destructive war in human history, and she was not going to let it go without fighting for it with every resource she possessed. Her answer came in the form of a kiss that tasted like tears and determination, a wordless commitment that sealed their fate as surely as any spoken vow. They spent the rest of that night walking through Paris, memorizing streets they might never see together again, planning details of a deception that would either save them both or destroy them completely. Klaus would need to disappear during the chaos of the final evacuation, making his absence appear accidental rather than deliberate. Margaret would prepare a hiding place in her apartment, gathering supplies and documents that might keep them alive during the dangerous weeks that would follow liberation. They would have to become different people entirely, inventing new identities and histories that could withstand scrutiny from authorities who would be hunting German collaborators and deserters with systematic thoroughness. The technical challenges were staggering. Klaus's German accent would need to be disguised or explained away, perhaps by claiming he was from Alsace, where French and German influences blended naturally. His military bearing and physical conditioning would mark him as a soldier to anyone with experience, requiring him to learn civilian mannerisms and postures that felt natural rather than performed. Most critically, they would need documentation that could survive official examination, papers that would transform a German communications officer into a French refugee fleeing from the fighting in the East. Margaret's resistance contacts included people skilled at creating false documents, but approaching them would require explanations she could never provide truthfully. She would have to construct elaborate lies about helping a French laborer who had lost his papers during bombing raids, stories that would satisfy suspicious patriots while concealing the true identity of the man she was trying to save. The deception would test every skill she had developed during 4 years of navigating the moral complexities of occupation. They met again the following evening, and the evening after that, each encounter deepening their commitment to a plan that seemed more impossible with every detail they examined. Klaus brought intelligence about German evacuation schedules and defensive preparations, information that would have been valuable to the resistance if Margaret had been willing to share it. Instead, she used his knowledge to refine their timing, identifying the precise moment when his disappearance would be most likely to go unnoticed. The city around them was transforming with increasing speed as liberation approached. Allied reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead with impunity, photographing German positions and supply lines. Radio broadcasts from London spoke openly of American and British forces advancing toward Paris, making no attempt to conceal strategic information that had been carefully guarded for months. French civilians who had maintained careful neutrality throughout the occupation began displaying subtle signs of their true allegiances, wearing clothing combinations that suggested patriotic colors, humming songs that had been forbidden, exchanging glances that carried decades of suppressed hope. Klaus found himself in the surreal position of helping to plan the evacuation of forces he intended to abandon, coordinating communications for a retreat he would not participate in. His fellow officers noticed his increasing distraction, but attributed it to the stress that was affecting everyone as they prepared to leave the city they had controlled for 4 years. He volunteered for additional duties that would give him access to civilian areas, ostensibly for reconnaissance purposes, but actually to scout locations and establish connections that might prove useful during his planned desertion. Margit used her sewing skills to create the civilian identity Klaus would need, altering clothes to fit him properly, while making them appear worn and lived in rather than newly acquired. She practiced stories about their relationship, creating a history of romance that began before the war and survived separation when her fictional fiancé was conscripted for labor service in Germany. The lies came easier than she had expected, perhaps because they were built around a core of genuine emotion that made even invented details feel authentic. The resistance network she had served in small ways began preparing for active operations, stockpiling weapons and ammunition for the uprising that would accompany liberation. Margit found herself in possession of information about German defensive plans that could save French lives and accelerate the city's freedom, intelligence that Klaus had shared without considering how she might use it. The moral weight of keeping such information secret felt crushing, but revealing it would expose their relationship and destroy any chance Klaus had of surviving the coming chaos. 3 days before the scheduled departure of Klaus's unit, Margit received news that changed everything they had planned. Her resistance contacts informed her that Allied forces were advancing faster than expected, that liberation might come within days rather than weeks. The accelerated timeline compressed their already impossible schedule into something that felt like attempting to perform surgery during an earthquake. Klaus confirmed the reports through his own channels, learning that German High Command had ordered immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel. His communications unit would leave Paris in 48 hours, 2 days earlier than originally scheduled. The compressed timeline meant they would have only one opportunity to execute their plan, with no possibility of delay or second attempts if something went wrong. That night, they met for what they both understood might be their final conversation as themselves, the last time Klaus would appear in German uniform, and the last time Margit could speak freely without worrying about maintaining their fictional cover story. They walked through the Marais district, where they had first encountered each other, past the bombed bookstore where scattered poetry had brought them together, through streets that had become sacred to them during their brief courtship. The conversation they shared felt like a form of prayer, two people asking forgiveness from whatever forces governed human destiny for the choices they were about to make. Klaus spoke of his parents, who would never know what had happened to their son, who would spend the rest of their lives wondering whether he had died in battle or simply vanished into the chaos of defeat. Margit thought of her father, killed during the early days of occupation, trying to imagine whether he would understand the impossible choice she was making between patriotic duty and personal love. They found themselves once again at the corner where they had shared their first kiss, standing under the street lamp that had become their unofficial shrine to the power of human connection in inhuman times. This time, their embrace carried the weight of everything they were risking, everything they might lose, everything they hoped to preserve through the storm that was about to break over them. Klaus pressed a small object into Margit's hand, something he had carried throughout his military service without understanding why it had seemed important to preserve. It was a pressed flower from his mother's garden, a violet that had somehow retained its color and fragrance despite being dried and flattened between the pages of a book for over 2 years. The flower represented everything beautiful and peaceful about the world he had left behind, everything he hoped to rediscover with Margit when the killing finally stopped. Margit gave him in return a photograph of herself taken before the war, a formal portrait that showed her wearing a dress she had designed and sewn herself, her eyes bright with the confidence and optimism that 4 years of occupation had not quite managed to extinguish. On the back, she had written a single line from one of the Verlaine poems they had discovered together, words that captured everything they felt but could never safely speak aloud. Their final kiss lasted until they heard footsteps approaching, the sound of a German patrol making its rounds through the increasingly empty streets. They separated reluctantly, Klaus melting into the shadows that led toward his barracks, while Margit hurried home to make final preparations for the most dangerous gamble of her life. Neither looked back, understanding that seeing the other's face one more time might shatter the resolve they had spent days building toward this impossible moment of commitment. The next morning brought news that would test their plan in ways they had never anticipated. Radio broadcasts announced that American forces had broken through German defensive lines and were racing toward Paris faster than anyone had predicted. Liberation might come within hours rather than days, compressing their already desperate timeline into something that felt like trying to outrun an avalanche. Klaus received emergency orders to report immediately for evacuation, the carefully planned departure schedule, abandoned in favor of immediate retreat before Allied forces could cut off escape routes. He had perhaps 2 hours to disappear before his absence would be noticed, 2 hours to transform from German communications officer to French civilian refugee. The margin for error had shrunk to nothing, leaving no room for hesitation or second thoughts. Margaret waited in her apartment, surrounded by forged documents and civilian clothes, listening to the sound of German vehicles racing through the streets as the occupation apparatus collapsed with stunning speed. She had prepared everything she could think of, but success would depend on timing and luck in equal measure. If Klaus arrived too early, they might be caught before liberation provided cover for their deception. If he arrived too late, he might not arrive at all. The sound of footsteps on the stairs outside her apartment could have belonged to anyone: German soldiers conducting final searches, resistance fighters beginning their uprising, neighbors seeking shelter from the chaos erupting throughout the city. When the gentle knock came at her door, using the pattern they had agreed upon, Margaret felt her heart stop completely before exploding back to life with an intensity that made her hands shake as she turned the lock. Klaus stood in her doorway, no longer wearing his uniform, his face pale with exhaustion and fear, but his eyes bright with the desperate hope of someone who had successfully completed the first stage of an impossible escape. He stepped inside quickly, and Margaret closed the door behind him, sealing them both into the small space that would either become their sanctuary or their tomb. Outside, the liberation of Paris was beginning with gunfire and celebration, with the sound of church bells that had been silent for 4 years, and voices raised in songs that had been forbidden since 1940. Inside Margaret's apartment, 2 people who had chosen love over survival held each other while the world transformed around them, knowing that their greatest challenges still lay ahead, but committed to facing them together regardless of the cost. The transformation Klaus underwent in those first moments inside Margaret's apartment was remarkable to witness. The rigid posture that military training had carved into his spine melted away, replaced by the natural movements of someone finally allowed to be human rather than soldier. His hands, accustomed to gripping weapons and communications equipment, now moved with tentative uncertainty as he touched objects in her modest living space, running his fingers along the spines of books, examining the delicate embroidery work that decorated her few possessions. Margaret watched this metamorphosis with fascination and growing tenderness. She had only known Klaus in uniform, had only seen him as the enemy soldier who quoted French poetry and carried himself with reluctant authority. Now she was discovering the man beneath the military facade, someone younger and more vulnerable than she had imagined, someone whose hands shook slightly as he attempted to shed not just his physical uniform, but the psychological armor that had protected him during months of moral compromise. The civilian clothes she had prepared fit him reasonably well, though they hung differently on his frame than the tailored precision of his military dress. She had chosen garments that were worn but respectable, the kind of clothing a working man might own if he took pride in his appearance but could not afford luxury. The transformation was not just visual but psychological, as Klaus gradually relaxed into postures and expressions that had been suppressed by military discipline for over 2 years. Outside their small sanctuary, the sounds of liberation grew more intense with each passing hour. Artillery fire that had seemed distant that morning was now close enough to rattle the windows, while small arms fire crackled through the streets like deadly fireworks. The church bells of Paris, silent since the German occupation began, suddenly burst into joyous cacophony as news spread that Allied forces had entered the city's outskirts. Citizens who had maintained careful neutrality for 4 years began emerging from their homes, some carrying weapons they had hidden since 1940, others simply standing in doorways to witness history unfolding before their eyes. Klaus and Margit spent those early hours of liberation rehearsing the fiction that would need to sustain them through the dangerous weeks ahead. He practiced speaking French with the accent of someone from Alsace-Lorraine, a region where German influence would explain any linguistic peculiarities that might surface under stress. She coached him on local customs and references that would mark him as a genuine Parisian rather than an outsider attempting to blend in. They created elaborate backstories about his supposed work in German labor camps, experiences that would account for his physical conditioning, while explaining any gaps in his knowledge of recent events in occupied Paris. The forged documents Margit had acquired were masterful examples of wartime deception, complete with official stamps and signatures that could fool casual inspection. Klaus's new identity papers identified him as Henry Dubois, a metal worker from the 20th arrondissement who had been conscripted for factory work in the Ruhr Valley 18 months earlier. The fictional narrative explained his absence from Paris during the crucial period, when most residents had developed the shared experiences and references that bound communities together under occupation. As afternoon dissolved into evening, the character of the fighting outside began to change. The systematic artillery bombardments that had marked the approach of Allied forces gave way to the sharp, irregular sounds of urban warfare. Street fighting had begun in earnest as German rear guard units attempted to delay the advancing Americans and British, while French resistance fighters emerged from hiding to settle scores accumulated over 4 years of oppression and collaboration. The apartment building where they sheltered became a microcosm of the larger drama unfolding throughout Paris. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years without acknowledging each other's political loyalties suddenly found themselves forced to choose sides, as liberation created opportunities for both heroism and revenge. Margit could hear heated arguments through the thin walls, accusations and counter-accusations as residents debated who had been too friendly with German authorities and who deserved punishment for collaboration real or imagined. Klaus listened to these conversations with growing unease, understanding enough French to grasp the violent emotions being unleashed by the prospect of freedom. The apartment building's concierge, an elderly woman who had somehow managed to maintain everyone's respect throughout the occupation, was now being questioned about her interactions with German officials who had requisitioned rooms for visiting personnel. A baker from the ground floor found himself defending business relationships that had kept his shop supplied with flour when other establishments had been forced to close. The most chilling moment came when someone mentioned seeing German soldiers in civilian clothes attempting to blend into the population. A neighbor reported spotting suspicious individuals near the metro station, men whose bearing and mannerisms suggested military training despite their ordinary dress. The conversation that followed made Klaus's blood run cold as residents discussed what should be done with enemy personnel caught, attempting to escape justice for their role in the occupation. Margit squeezed his hand reassuringly as they listened to their neighbors debating the fate of German deserters, but both understood the mortal danger they faced if their deception was discovered. The liberation that had seemed like salvation now revealed itself as potentially the most dangerous phase of their entire relationship. During the occupation, the rules had been clear even if brutal. Now they found themselves in a world where old certainties had collapsed, and new forms of justice were being improvised by people whose judgment had been shaped by years of suffering and suppressed rage. The night brought no respite from the violence outside. If anything, the fighting intensified as resistance fighters used the cover of darkness to launch attacks they had been planning for months or even years. The sound of explosions echoed through the narrow streets as bridges and communication facilities were destroyed to prevent German forces from conducting organized withdrawals. Machine gun fire rattled from rooftops where snipers engaged in deadly duels with retreating soldiers who had chosen to fight rather than surrender. Klaus and Margit took turns keeping watch at the apartment's single window, observing the chaos while remaining invisible to the combatants below. They saw French civilians emerging from buildings with weapons that had been hidden since the defeat of 1940, saw German vehicles burning in the streets where they had been abandoned by crews fleeing on foot, saw the first American soldiers moving cautiously through intersections, while French guides pointed out remaining pockets of resistance. The liberation of their immediate neighborhood came just before dawn, announced by the arrival of an American patrol that was greeted with cheers and embraces from residents who had spent the night hiding in cellars and stairwells. Klaus watched from behind Margit's curtains as his former enemies were welcomed as liberators, understanding with perfect clarity that he would be shot without trial if his true identity was discovered by the same people who were now distributing American cigarettes and chocolate to celebrating children. The psychological strain of maintaining their deception while surrounded by such intense emotions began taking its toll on both of them. Klaus found himself jumping at unexpected sounds, his body's conditioned responses to military situations creating reactions that could betray him if observed by suspicious neighbors. Margit struggled to appear naturally joyful about liberation, while concealing her terror that the man she loved might be discovered and killed by the very forces she was supposed to celebrate. Their first real test came that afternoon when the building's concierge knocked on Margit's door, accompanied by two French resistance fighters who were conducting systematic interviews with all residents. The men were polite but thorough, asking detailed questions about activities during the occupation, associations with German personnel, and knowledge of collaboration by neighbors or acquaintances. They carried lists of suspected collaborators and were clearly prepared to act on information that confirmed their suspicions. Margit introduced Klaus as her fiancé Henry, recently returned from forced labor in Germany, explaining his presence with a mixture of truth and fiction that sounded entirely natural. She described their reunion with emotions that were genuine even if the circumstances were invented, speaking of letters that had sustained their relationship through months of separation and uncertainty. Klaus played his role perfectly, responding to questions with the quiet dignity of someone who had endured hardship but maintained his integrity. The resistance fighters seemed satisfied with their explanations, but they left behind a warning that made both Klaus and Margit understand how precarious their situation remained. German personnel attempting to escape in civilian clothes had been spotted throughout the city, they explained, and residents were expected to report any suspicious individuals to the proper authorities. The penalty for harboring enemy soldiers would be severe, they emphasized, as such actions threatened the security of the newly liberated population. As the days passed and liberation became an established reality rather than a hoped-for dream, Klaus and Margit began to understand that their greatest challenges were just beginning. The initial chaos of street fighting had given way to a more systematic process of identifying and punishing those who had collaborated with the occupation authorities. Tribunals were being established to judge cases of treason and collaboration, while informal justice was being dispensed in the streets against those whose guilt seemed obvious to their neighbors. The psychological pressure of maintaining their false identities in this environment was almost unbearable. Every conversation required careful attention to avoid references that might reveal Klaus's true background, while every social interaction carried the risk that someone might ask questions that could not be answered satisfactorily. They lived in constant fear that a former German colleague might recognize Klaus on the street, or that a neighbor might notice inconsistencies in their carefully constructed story. Yet something remarkable was also happening between them during these dangerous weeks. The shared stress of their situation, the absolute dependence on each other for survival, the daily proof that they were both willing to risk everything for their relationship, created a bond deeper than anything they could have imagined during their brief courtship before liberation. They were no longer simply two people who had fallen in love despite impossible circumstances, but partners in the most intimate conspiracy imaginable, completely dependent on each other's courage and discretion. Klaus began to discover aspects of Margit's character that her gentle demeanor had concealed. Under pressure, she revealed herself to be remarkably resourceful and decisive, capable of improvising solutions to problems that would have paralyzed someone less adaptable. Her network of contacts throughout the neighborhood, relationships she had cultivated carefully during 4 years of occupation, now provided them with information and protection that proved invaluable as they navigated the treacherous politics of liberation. Margit, meanwhile, was learning that Klaus possessed depths of strength and determination that his scholarly background had not suggested. The man who had quoted poetry in bookstore ruins proved capable of transforming himself completely when survival demanded it, adopting mannerisms and speech patterns that made his fictional identity seem entirely natural. His ability to remain calm under extreme stress, to think clearly when panic would have been the natural response, suggested reserves of character that military service had developed but not revealed. The city around them was transforming with stunning speed as French authority was re-established and the infrastructure of occupation was dismantled. German street signs were torn down and replaced with their French equivalents, while buildings that had housed occupation offices were reclaimed by their original owners or converted to serve liberation authorities. The systematic efficiency with which Paris shed its German identity and reclaimed its French character was remarkable to witness, but it also created new dangers for Klaus and Margit as every change in the urban landscape created opportunities for their deception to be discovered. The most dangerous moment came during the 3rd week after liberation, when a comprehensive registration of all residents was announced. Every person living in Paris would be required to appear before local authorities with documentation proving their identity and explaining their activities during the occupation. The process was designed to identify German personnel who might be hiding in the civilian population, but it would also expose anyone whose papers or story could not withstand official scrutiny. Klaus and Margit spent sleepless nights preparing for this examination, rehearsing every detail of his fictional biography while examining their forged documents for flaws that might betray them under close inspection. The stakes could not have been higher, as failure would mean not just Klaus's execution, but Margit's trial for treason and collaboration. They had come too far and risked too much to fail at this crucial test of their carefully constructed deception. The morning of Klaus's appointment arrived gray and rainy, the kind of weather that made everyone hurry through the streets with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with strangers. He dressed carefully in his working-class clothes, carrying identity papers that proclaimed him to be Henry Dubois, metal worker and forced laborer, recently returned to his beloved Paris after 18 months of involuntary service in German industrial facilities. Margit accompanied him partway to the municipal building, where the registrations were being conducted, walking beside him with the natural intimacy of a woman escorting her fiancé to an important appointment. Their final conversation before separation was conducted in the coded language they had developed, expressing love and encouragement in terms that would sound innocent to any observer, but carried layers of meaning that sustained them through the approaching trial. The registration office was crowded with Parisians of every description, all carrying the documents and testimonies that would prove their right to remain in the city they called home. Klaus took his place in line between an elderly professor who had hidden Jewish refugees throughout the occupation and a young mother whose husband had died fighting with the resistance. The diversity of stories and experiences represented in that room reminded him of everything that was at stake in the examination he was about to undergo. When his turn finally came, Klaus approached the registration desk with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, presenting his forged papers to officials who had seen hundreds of similar documents that day. The questions came exactly as he and Margit had anticipated, covering his supposed work in German factories, his journey back to Paris, his plans for rebuilding his life in the liberated city. His answers were perfect, delivered with just the right mixture of weariness and hope that characterized so many genuine returnees. The critical moment arrived when one of the officials noticed discrepancies in the stamps on his identity card, variations that could indicate forgery or simply the bureaucratic chaos that had characterized the final months of German administration. Klaus felt his heart stop as the man examined the documents more closely, calling over a colleague to provide a second opinion on their authenticity. The second stretched into an eternity as the two officials huddled over Klaus's papers, their voices low but urgent as they debated the authenticity of stamps and signatures that represented the difference between freedom and death. Klaus maintained the posture of patient cooperation that Henry Dubois would naturally display, but beneath the surface his mind raced through contingency plans that all seemed to lead toward disaster. The whispered conversation between the officials seemed to last forever, though Klaus understood it could only have been minutes. Other applicants in line behind him grew restless, shuffling their feet and muttering complaints about the delay. The elderly professor directly behind him offered sympathetic comments about bureaucratic inefficiency, creating a moment of human connection that Klaus desperately needed, but dared not fully acknowledge. Finally, the senior official looked up from the documents with an expression that Klaus could not read. The man's weathered face had seen too many forgeries and genuine papers to reveal his conclusions through mere facial expressions. When he spoke, his voice carried the neutral tone of someone trained to avoid showing favoritism or suspicion during official proceedings. The questions that followed were more detailed than Klaus had expected, probing specific aspects of his supposed experience in German labor camps that required careful improvisation. He drew upon stories Margit had helped him memorize, accounts gathered from actual forced laborers who had returned to Paris in recent weeks. The details came naturally now, polished through countless rehearsals until they felt like genuine memories rather than carefully constructed fiction. The breakthrough came when Klaus mentioned specific factories and locations that corresponded perfectly with intelligence reports the authorities had received from other returnees. His description of working conditions, guard procedures, and daily routines matched testimonies from dozens of other witnesses, creating a web of corroborating evidence that would have been impossible to fabricate without extensive inside knowledge. Klaus and Margit's story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, love finds ways to transcend the boundaries that hatred tries to impose. Their kiss beneath that Parisian street lamp was more than a moment of passion. It was an act of rebellion against a world determined to keep hearts divided. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't found on battlefields, but in the quiet choice to see humanity in those we're told to hate, to risk everything for connection when survival demands isolation. Their love survived because they refused to let fear conquer hope, proving that the human heart recognizes no uniform, no flag, no enemy when it encounters another soul willing to choose love over war.